Hello, and welcome back to the Hacker News Daily, where we bring you the top stories that got the tech community talking. I'm your host, and today we're diving into yesterday's most heated discussions from across 30 stories that hit the front page. And wow, what a day it was. We saw over 3,000 comments on just our top story alone. That's the kind of engagement you only see when something really strikes a nerve. From fundamental shifts in how we control our devices, to decades-old software suddenly getting its moment in the spotlight, to the ongoing arms race between websites and bots. Yesterday's Hacker News was all about control, discovery, and the tensions between openness and security in our digital world. So let's jump right in with the story that had everyone up in arms. All right, so moving on to our next story, and this one really struck a nerve in the community. Google will allow only apps from verified developers to be installed on Android. Yeah, you heard that right. This has absolutely exploded on Hacker News with over 2,700 points and more than 2,000 comments. And let me tell you, the reaction is, well, it's not pretty. So here's what's happening. Google is essentially changing the fundamental nature of Android by requiring that all apps, and I mean all apps, not just ones from the Play Store, come from verified developers. This includes apps you sideload, apps you build yourself, everything. And the community is seeing this as nothing short of a betrayal of what Android was supposed to be. You know, Android has always positioned itself as the open alternative to iOS, right? The whole pitch was, hey, it's your device. You can do what you want with it. Want to install an app from outside the Play Store? Go for it. Want to build your own app and run it? No problem. That freedom was literally the main selling point for a huge portion of Android users, especially the technical crowd. But now, Google's basically saying, nope, we're going to be the gatekeepers. And the comparison everyone's making is obvious. This is Google trying to build their own walled garden, just like Apple. Except, as many commenters pointed out, at least with Apple, you know what you're getting into from day one. They've always been upfront about their closed ecosystem. Android users feel like they've had the rug pulled out from under them.
What really gets people fired up is the impact on open source development. Think about this for a second. If you're a developer who wants to build an app for your own personal use, or you're contributing to an open source project, you now need to register with Google as a verified developer just to run your own code on your own device. That's pretty wild when you think about it. It's like buying a computer and then being told you need Microsoft's permission to run any program you write yourself. The discussion on Hacker News is fascinating because it touches on these really fundamental questions about digital ownership. Do you actually own your device if you can't control what software runs on it? Several commenters made the point that this feels like you're essentially renting your phone from Google, even though you paid for it outright. Now, there was one interesting counterpoint in the discussion. A commenter named RVNX suggested that Google could have taken a middle ground approach, maybe show warning screens instead of outright blocking apps. They pointed out that Google's probably worried about apps like YouTube Vanced that directly impact their revenue streams. And look, I get it from a business perspective, but is this really the solution? Some folks in the thread are already talking about workarounds using ADB commands to disable Play Protect verification and things like that, but that's missing the larger point, isn't it? The average user isn't going to mess around with developer tools just to install an app. This effectively kills sideloading for 99% of Android users. What's particularly frustrating for many is that Android is losing its main competitive advantage over iOS without gaining any of the benefits. You're getting the restrictions of a closed ecosystem without Apple's generally smoother user experience, or their privacy focus, or their customer service. It's like the worst of both worlds. The timing of this is interesting too. We're seeing this broader trend across the tech industry where platforms that started open are gradually closing up. And every time it happens, we lose a little bit more of that original vision of personal computing where users had actual control over their devices. You know what really stood out to me in the comments? The sheer sense of betrayal. People who specifically chose Android because of its openness, who've been evangelizing it for years, defending it against iOS users, they're feeling completely let down. Some are already talking about jumping ship, though honestly, where do you go? iOS isn't any better in this regard, and the alternative Android forks don't have the app ecosystem most people need. This feels like one of those watershed moments in tech where we're watching a fundamental shift happen in real time. The era of truly open mobile platforms might be coming to an end, and that's genuinely concerning for the future of computing. Speaking of control and the ongoing battle between openness and security on the web, let me tell you about another story that perfectly captures this tension from a different angle. All right, now we're diving into something that'll resonate with anyone who's ever run a website. Our next story is titled, "Ban Me at the IP Level If You Don't Like Me," and it's got the Hacker News community absolutely fired up with over 570 points and 437 comments. This one's about a programmer who stumbled into what might be the most passive-aggressive bot in existence. So picture this. You're checking your server logs, and you notice this bot called ThinkBot absolutely hammering your site. Nothing too unusual there, right? Bots are everywhere these days. But here's where it gets weird. This bot's user agent literally says, and I'm not making this up, in the test phase, if the ThinkBot brings you trouble, please block its IP address. Thank you. It's like, thanks for the suggestion, buddy, except there's one tiny problem. This supposedly helpful bot isn't using just one IP address. It's using 74 different IPs spread across 41 different network blocks, all owned by Tencent, the Chinese tech giant. The irony here is just chef's kiss. The bot is essentially saying, hey, if I'm annoying, just block me, while simultaneously making itself nearly impossible to block through conventional means. It's like someone knocking on your door from 74 different locations at once and saying, if this bothers you, just don't answer the door. What really caught my attention, though, is the author's tinfoil hat theory. And honestly, it's not that tinfoily when you think about it. They suggest that maybe, just maybe, the Chinese government actually encourages this aggressive scraping behavior because it creates a win-win situation for them. If the scraping works, great, they get the data. If websites start blocking Chinese IP ranges entirely, well, that just helps enforce the Great Firewall from the outside. It's like externalizing the cost of internet censorship to the rest of the world. Pretty clever, if somewhat dystopian. The Hacker News discussion on this is fascinating because it reveals this isn't just some isolated incident. Web operators are coming out of the woodwork sharing their war stories. One commenter mentions they're seeing similar behavior from Microsoft, Facebook, and various AI companies. It's not just a China problem. The consensus seems to be that robots.txt, that gentleman's agreement of the web that's supposed to tell bots where they can and can't go, it's basically toilet paper at this point. The good bots that actually respect it get caught by anti-bot measures, while the bad actors just ignore it completely. There's this really interesting debate happening in the comments about whether blocking entire countries is justified. Some folks are like, look, I just blocked all of China's IP ranges and my problems went away. Others are pointing out that you're potentially cutting off legitimate users and that US companies are just as guilty of aggressive scraping. One commenter made a really good point. They said blocking China might make sense for a local pizza shop's website, but if you're running anything with global ambitions, you're basically writing off a huge chunk of the internet. But here's my favorite take from the discussion. There's this user, Bob1029, who basically says the whole bot fighting game is just ideological capture the flag that wastes everyone's time. Their argument, just build better, faster websites that can handle the load. Stop playing whack-a-mole with bots and just engineer your way out of the problem. It's a refreshingly pragmatic take, though I'm not sure everyone has the resources to just throw more servers at the problem. Another commenter, KLDG, raises an interesting question. What makes certain sites bot magnets in the first place? They're running a home server with minimal protection and barely see any bot traffic. Makes you wonder if some of us are just overthinking this whole thing. The technical arms race here is pretty wild too. We're talking about bots using residential proxies, rotating user agents, distributed infrastructure. It's like a cyber version of Tom and Jerry, except Tom has 74 different bodies and Jerry owns the website. And the tools people are using to fight back are equally sophisticated. Rate limiting, behavioral analysis, honeypots, geographic blocking.
You know what really strikes me about this whole situation? We've built this incredible global network that's supposed to be open and accessible, and now we're spending enormous amounts of time and energy basically building walls and moats around our little corners of it. It's like we're reverting to medieval castle architecture, but digital. And the most frustrating part? The bad actors have way more resources and way less to lose than the average website operator. The whole "ban me if you don't like me" message from ThinkBot, it's almost taunting in its simplicity. It's technically following some weird interpretation of politeness. It's announcing itself, it's giving you permission to block it, but it's doing it in the most unhelpful way possible. It's malicious compliance at its finest, or maybe worst, depending on how you look at it. Now, shifting gears from the chaos of the modern web to something that's been quietly existing in its own corner for over a decade. Story 3, Base SQLite Editor. All right, now let's dive into something that really caught my eye, and apparently caught a lot of other people's eyes too, with over 650 points on Hacker News. We're talking about ShowHN Base, an SQLite database editor for macOS. Now here's where things get really interesting. This isn't actually a new product launch at all. The discussion reveals that Base has been around for 15 years. Can you believe that? 15 years. And yet the comments are filled with people saying things like, "How have I never heard of this? And I've been searching for exactly this kind of tool." It's like discovering there's been a great restaurant in your neighborhood this whole time that somehow nobody ever mentioned. The product itself positions as this beautifully crafted native macOS SQLite editor. And when I say native, they really mean it. No Electron, no cross-platform compromises, just pure Mac software designed to feel right at home on your system. The tagline is small, powerful, comfortable, which honestly sounds more like an ad for a luxury car than database software, but that's kind of the point. They're going for that premium, artisanal software vibe. What really fascinates me about the discussion is this paradox of discoverability. You've got users who've been happily using Base for years, absolutely swearing by it, talking about how it's been their go-to tool. And then in the same thread, you have developers who are genuinely shocked it exists. One commenter mentioned they'd been specifically searching for SQLite tools and never came across it. That's a marketing problem, right? Or maybe it's the curse of being too niche, too focused on doing one thing really well, instead of trying to be everything to everyone.
The creator seems to have this philosophy of what several commenters called artisanal software development. It's not trying to be the Swiss Army knife of database tools. It's not trying to support PostgreSQL, MySQL, and every other database under the sun like TablePlus or DataGrip. It's just an SQLite editor for Mac users who want something that feels native and works well. And there's something refreshing about that focus in an era where every app wants to be a platform. Now, the pricing model is interesting. They've got both a free version and a paid version, though the specifics weren't entirely clear from the discussion. But what struck me is how many people in the comments were basically saying, "Shut up and take my money," just based on the philosophy and the long-term commitment to the product. Though not everyone's convinced. One user asked pretty bluntly what Base offers over the free open-source SQLite browser, which is a fair question when you're asking people to pay for something. The technical discussions got pretty specific too. People were asking about UUID support, whether foreign keys are enabled by default, which apparently they're not, and that bothered some folks, and whether you can load SQLite extensions. These might sound like minor details, but for developers working with SQLite daily, these little friction points really matter. And here's something that made me pause. One user mentioned they actually switched away from Base because it was crashing frequently for them. They moved to SQLite Pro, but then said SQLite Pro's development seems to have stagnated, so they're considering coming back to Base. It's like this whole subcategory of Mac SQLite editors is this weird landscape of tools that are either too old, too buggy, or too abandoned. What I find most compelling about this whole story is what it says about software development and marketing in 2024. Here is a product that's been around since roughly 2009, has loyal users who love it, does its job well, and yet it's essentially invisible to most of the people who would want to use it. It makes you wonder how many other great tools are out there, quietly doing their thing with a small but devoted user base, just waiting to be discovered, or rediscovered, as the case may be. The Show HN post almost feels like a relaunch, a second chance at getting the word out. And based on the engagement, 654 points, 169 comments, it seems to be working. Sometimes in tech, timing is everything, and maybe after 15 years, Base's time has finally come. Or maybe it's just that Hacker News on the right day can shine a spotlight on something that deserved attention all along.
Speaking of things that deserve more attention, let's talk about how we teach and understand the fundamentals of our field. Our next two stories both tackle this in really interesting ways. Story 4, a visual introduction to Big O notation. All right, so moving on to something that really sparked a heated debate in the community. Our next story is a visual introduction to Big O notation. And wow, this one pulled in over 600 points and nearly 180 comments. You know what's fascinating here? It's not just about the content itself, but how it exposed this fundamental tension in our field about how we teach complex computer science concepts. So this article takes Big O notation, that mathematical way we describe how algorithms perform as they scale up, and instead of throwing formulas at you, it actually makes you run JavaScript code right in your browser. You're literally watching your computer count to 1 billion, then 2 billion, and seeing firsthand how the execution time changes. It's brilliant, really. Instead of abstract theory, you're feeling the performance difference in real time. The author breaks down 4 main complexity categories: constant time, logarithmic, linear, and quadratic. But here's where it gets interesting. They deliberately avoid the mathematical jargon that usually comes with this stuff. No calculus, no formal proofs, just here's what happens when your input doubles. And that approach, it's causing quite the stir in the comments. See, there's this commenter, Dawn of Dusk, who makes a really compelling point. They're saying, look, we're doing students a disservice by avoiding the math. Big O notation is calculus. It's about limits and growth rates. And by pretending it isn't, we're creating this weird disconnect. They argue that instead of dumbing things down, we should be explaining the terminology properly. And honestly, they might have a point there. But then you've got the other camp, and this is where it gets wild. There's this developer, Chicago Dave, who drops this bombshell. 40 years in the industry, working as a coder, architect, the whole 9 yards, and they claim they've never once needed Big O notation. 40 years. They're basically saying, I've built real systems, solved real problems, and this theoretical stuff never came up. Now, that generated some pushback, as you'd imagine. The technical accuracy debate is pretty fierce, too. Some commenters are pointing out that the article conflates worst-case scenarios with typical Big O analysis, which, yeah, that's not quite right. Big O can describe best case, average case, or worst case. It's just a tool for describing growth rates. But here's the thing. Does that inaccuracy matter if it helps someone finally understand the concept? That's the million-dollar question.
What I find really clever about this article is how it handles the problem of wall clock timing. You know how when you benchmark code, you get different results every time? Different on different machines, different when your computer's doing other stuff. The article uses this inconsistency to explain why we need Big O notation in the first place. It's not about this takes 2.3 seconds. It's about when you double the input, the time doubles too. That's a pattern that holds regardless of whether you're on a supercomputer or a Raspberry Pi. Oh, and there's this subtle thing that caught my eye. The article is sponsored by something called IttyBit, which is apparently an API for media files. It's interesting seeing educational content like this being monetized through sponsorships. Makes you wonder about the sustainability of high-quality technical education online, right? The visual approach itself is getting praised, though, and rightfully so. Instead of static diagrams, you're watching bars grow, seeing numbers climb, experiencing the difference between linear and quadratic growth. One commenter mentioned how they've been trying to explain Big O to junior developers for years, and this visual approach finally made it click for their team. But you know what really stands out in this whole discussion? It's highlighting this fundamental divide in how we think about computer science education. Should we be teaching the pure mathematical foundations, embracing the formality and rigor, or should we focus on practical intuition, on what developers actually need day to day? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, but this article and the reaction to it shows we're nowhere near consensus on that. And honestly, the fact that someone with 40 decades of experience can say they've never needed Big O notation, while others insist it's fundamental to understanding algorithms, that tells you something about the diversity of work in our field. Maybe you're optimizing database queries where understanding complexity is crucial, or maybe you're building CRUD apps where it genuinely never comes up. Both are valid experiences, but they lead to very different perspectives on what's essential knowledge. And speaking of fundamental concepts that we might not fully understand, let's talk about something even more basic but surprisingly complex: color. All right, so our next story really caught fire on Hacker News. What are OKLCH colors? And honestly, this might be one of those paradigm shifts that completely changes how we think about digital color. We're talking 804 points and 181 comments worth of heated technical debate here.
So here's the thing. If you've ever tried to create a color palette for a website or app, you've probably run into this incredibly frustrating problem. You pick two colors with the exact same lightness value in HSL, thinking they'll look equally bright, and then one looks way darker than the other. It's maddening. And it turns out this isn't just you being bad at design. It's because RGB and HSL, the color models we've been using for decades, are fundamentally broken when it comes to matching human perception. Enter OKLCH, which is, okay, bear with me here because this gets a bit technical, but it's actually fascinating. OKLCH uses three values: lightness, which goes from 0 to 1, chroma, which is basically how intense or vivid the color is, and hue, which is your standard 360-degree color wheel. But here's the kicker. It's based on something called the OKLab color space, which was specifically designed to be perceptually uniform. What that means in practice is that if two colors have the same lightness value in OKLCH, they'll actually look the same brightness to your eyes. Revolutionary, right? Now, the Hacker News crowd, being who they are, immediately started poking holes in this. And some of the criticism is pretty valid. One major issue that came up repeatedly in the comments is gradient interpolation. Apparently, when you try to create gradients in OKLCH, especially when you're interpolating hues around the color circle, you can run into these weird situations where the colors go out of gamut. Basically, they become impossible colors that your screen can't actually display, and you get this unexpected darkening effect. One commenter pointed out that the article's examples of better gradients in OKLCH aren't objectively better, they're just consistently colorful, which isn't always what you want. There's also this whole debate about chroma versus saturation that's really interesting. See, in HSL, we're used to thinking about saturation as a percentage. 100% saturated is as vivid as that color can get. But in OKLCH, chroma is this unbounded value that, well, it doesn't really have an intuitive maximum. You can set chroma to 0.4, but what does that mean? Is that a lot? A little? Several developers in the comments mentioned that OKLCH makes it way less intuitive for everyday use compared to HSL, even if it's technically more accurate.
But here's where it gets really philosophical, and I love this about the Hacker News discussion. Some folks are arguing that maybe we've been thinking about color wrong this entire time. One commenter made this brilliant point that for realistic light mixing, like if you're trying to simulate how actual light behaves in the real world, you shouldn't use OKLCH or HSL at all. You should use XYZ color space. But then someone else countered that most of us aren't trying to simulate physics, we're trying to make things look good to human eyes. And that's where OKLCH shines. The practical implications here are huge. If OKLCH catches on, and it's already supported in modern browsers, it could make a lot of our existing color tools obsolete. All those color pickers and palette generators we've been using, they might need complete overhauls. And for developers who've spent years mastering the quirks of RGB and HSL, well, it's basically like being told you need to relearn color theory from scratch. What really struck me about this discussion, though, is how it reveals this fundamental tension in tech. We have this new, theoretically superior solution in OKLCH, but it comes with its own set of trade-offs and complications. Some developers are saying, look, OKLag might actually be better for gradients. Use OKLCH for maintaining consistent colors, but switch to OKLab when you need smooth transitions. Others are like, this is all over-engineered. HSL works fine if you know what you're doing. And you know what? They're probably both right. The article itself might be overselling OKLCH a bit. One sharp-eyed commenter noted that the OKLCH example actually shows a pretty clear green shift, which is arguably worse than the purple shift it's criticizing in HSL. But at the same time, having a color model that actually respects how our eyes work, that's genuinely game-changing for accessibility and design consistency. The whole thing reminds me why I love these deep technical discussions. It's not just about the technology itself, but how we perceive the world and how we can better translate that perception into the digital realm. OKLCH might not be perfect, but it's pushing us to think differently about something as fundamental as color. And that's pretty exciting. And that wraps up today's dive into yesterday's top hacker news stories. What a journey, right? We started with Google fundamentally changing what it means to own an Android device, explored the ongoing arms race between websites and bots, discovered a 15-year-old Mac app that somehow stayed hidden in plain sight, and dove deep into how we teach and understand the fundamentals of computer science and even color itself. What strikes me about all these stories is they're really about control and understanding. Who controls our devices? Who controls access to our websites? How we control and understand the tools we use, and how we grasp the fundamental concepts that underpin everything we build. These aren't just technical discussions, they're about the philosophy of technology and our relationship with it. The engagement on these stories, we're talking thousands and thousands of comments across just these 5 topics, shows that these questions really matter to the community. Whether it's a developer with 40 years of experience saying big O notation never mattered to them, or someone discovering the perfect SQLite tool after years of searching, or the collective outrage over Android's transformation, these discussions shape how we think about and build technology. Tomorrow, we'll be back with another set of stories from Hacker News Daily, diving into whatever captures the community's attention next. Until then, keep questioning, keep building, and remember, sometimes the most interesting discoveries are the ones that have been hiding in plain sight for 15 years. This has been your Hacker News Daily. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you tomorrow.